The storm came without warning. One moment the sky above Vaelther's mountain range was dark and quiet, the way it always was at the end of a long day. The next, the clouds split open and the wind screamed through the valleys like something alive and angry. Rain fell so hard it looked like solid water. Lightning hit the rock faces again and again, and the sound of thunder rolled through the peaks for hours without stopping. By morning, the nesting ground was gone. The Draconis elders stood at the edge of what used to be a clutch site. The rock shelf where the eggs had rested was shattered. Boulders had rolled down the slope and crushed most of the nest flat. The eggs, 6 of them, large and dark green, each one carrying a life inside, were broken open, their insides already cold. All except one. One egg had been thrown clear by the force of the rockslide. It had rolled down a lower slope and come to rest against a twisted tree root near the base of the mountain. It was cracked. There was a long split running from the top almost to the bottom, and the shell had gone pale and dull where it should have been warm and dark. But it was still whole enough to hold its shape, and when Commander Vreth leaned down and pressed one clawed hand carefully against the surface, he felt something faint. A pulse. Barely there, like the last flicker of a candle before it went out. He stood up and looked at the other elders. No one said anything for a moment. "It will not survive the transport," said one of the elders. His name was Kale, and he had lived long enough to see many clutches. His voice was not cruel, just flat with certainty. "The crack goes too deep. If we move it, it will break apart completely. And even if it does not, a hatchling that begins this week will not grow into anything strong." Vreth said nothing. He looked at the egg for a long time. Then he picked it up with both hands and carried it down the mountain himself, walking slowly, keeping it level against his chest. The joint research station at the base of the Vaelther range was not built for this kind of emergency. It was a quiet place, a cluster of low buildings tucked between the rock and a narrow river, where human scientists and Draconis officers worked together on something called mutual understanding, which mostly meant they ate in the same room and disagreed politely about data. There were 12 humans posted there at any given time and 6 Draconis, and most days the biggest problem anyone had was the water recycler making a strange noise. Caleb Horn was in the middle of writing a field report when the door to the main lab opened, and Commander Vreth walked in carrying what looked like a very large, damaged rock. Caleb was 34 years old, quiet by nature, and had spent the last 2 years on Vaelther studying Draconis biology with the kind of careful patience that most people mistook for shyness. He had brown hair that was always slightly too long, a habit of going still when he was thinking, and hands that were steady even when everything else was not. He looked up from his report and saw the egg and did not say anything immediately, because he had learned that with the Draconis, silence was usually more useful than words. Vreth set the egg down on the central table. The other humans in the room stopped what they were doing and looked. "The storm destroyed the clutch," Vreth said. "This one survived. We are not sure for how long." Caleb stood up and walked over. He looked at the crack running down the shell. He looked at the dull, faded color. He did not touch it yet, just leaned close and watched, and after a moment he thought he saw the faintest movement. A tiny, irregular shift in the shell, like something breathing very slowly on the other side. Dr. Lena Marsh came in from the side room, wiping her hands on a cloth. She was the station's lead researcher, sharp-eyed and practical, the kind of person who fixed problems by naming them clearly and then working backward. She took one look at the egg, and her expression went careful. "What are our options?" she asked Vreth. "The Council's position is that the egg is compromised," Vreth said. "A hatchling that begins this damaged is not useful to the collective. The correct decision is to leave it and allow nature to decide." Lena nodded slowly, in the way she nodded when she was not agreeing but did not want to argue yet. "And what is your position?" she asked. Vreth looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the egg. "I carried it down the mountain," he said, and left the room. The meeting that followed lasted almost 2 hours. The Draconis staff argued that keeping the egg alive artificially was pointless and possibly dishonest. If the hatchling could not survive on its own strength, survival did not mean strength. 2 of the human researchers agreed, at least in terms of resource use. Lena was neutral, which meant she was waiting for more information. The decision, formally, was to leave the egg in the lab and monitor it overnight and then reassess in the morning. Everyone went to bed. Caleb did not go to bed. He sat in the lab alone for a while, just watching the egg. The room was quiet. The storm had passed, and the air outside was still and cold, and through the small window above the table he could see a strip of dark sky beginning to lighten at the very edge where the mountains met the horizon. He got up and went to the storage room. He came back with 2 thick blankets, a small heat lamp from a field supply kit, and a roll of insulating tape. He worked quietly. He arranged the blankets into a kind of nest on the table, set the lamp at the right angle, and placed the egg carefully in the center. Then he sat back down in his chair and watched the temperature reading on the side of the lamp until it settled into a range that felt right. Nobody had told him to do this. Nobody had told him not to, either. He stayed there all night, checking the reading every hour, adjusting the angle of the lamp when the temperature dropped, talking quietly to the egg sometimes in a low voice, not really saying anything meaningful, just keeping the air around it full of sound and warmth. By the time the morning shift came in and the station began to wake up, the egg was still whole. The crack had not spread. The shell had gone a shade darker, which meant something inside was generating heat again. Lena walked in, took one look at the setup, and looked at Caleb, who was still in his chair with dark circles under his eyes and his field report still unfinished on the desk. "You stayed all night," she said. "It was still warm," he said. "I didn't want to leave it." She looked at the egg. She looked at him. Then she pulled up a stool and sat down beside him and started reading the temperature logs from the night. She did not tell him he had done something wrong. The egg hatched on a Tuesday, just before sunrise. Nobody planned for it. There was no ceremony, no formal gathering of elders, no fire-lighting ritual that the Draconis usually performed when a new hatchling came into the world. It was just Caleb sitting at the table alone in the early morning, checking the temperature log and drinking cold coffee, when the crack in the shell spread suddenly sideways and a piece of it fell off onto the table with a soft click. Caleb set down his cup. For a long moment nothing else happened. Then another piece of shell fell. Then another. Then a small, pale gray claw reached out through the gap and curled around the edge of the crack, and a moment later the top of a head appeared. Small, triangular, covered in scales that were the color of old silver. The hatchling pushed and shoved and finally fell out of the egg entirely and landed in the nest of blankets, making a sound like a very small, very surprised sneeze. Caleb did not move. He sat perfectly still and watched. The hatchling lay there for a moment, blinking. Its eyes were enormous and golden, like 2 small suns pressed into a face that was still figuring out what shape it wanted to be. Its wings were folded flat against its back, thin and slightly translucent at the edges, catching the light in a way that made them look like they were made of paper. It was smaller than a Draconis hatchling was supposed to be. Caleb knew enough about their development to know that. It was maybe 2/3 the expected size, maybe less. But it was breathing, steady and even. Its chest rose and fell with a rhythm that felt strong despite everything. The hatchling lifted its head and looked directly at Caleb. Caleb looked back. They stayed like that for almost a full minute. Then the hatchling made a soft sound, something between a chirp and a sigh, and took one wobbly step toward Caleb across the blanket. That was how the imprinting happened. Not with fire or thunder or the great formal ceremonies of the Draconis. Just a small gray dragon, barely an hour old, deciding that the first warm and quiet thing it had seen was the one it wanted to stay near. Caleb named him Soren, quietly, mostly to himself, because he needed something to call him when the hatchling was doing something small and important and Caleb needed to describe it in his notes. The Draconis staff did not take the hatching well. The problem was not the hatching itself. A new life coming into the world was not something any Draconis would call a bad thing. The problem was what Soren did next, which was to cry. Not the sharp, aggressive cry of a normal hatchling announcing itself to the world, the kind of sound that was supposed to say, "Here I am strong, I am here." This was something quieter and more persistent. A soft, trembling sound, low and continuous, like a question that did not know what it was asking. It started in the afternoons and went all through the night, and it did not stop for the first 3 days. Elder Kale arrived on the 2nd day. He stood outside the enclosure that had been set up for Soren in the medical bay and listened to the crying with an expression that Caleb had learned to read as controlled disgust. "This is the sound of weakness," Kale said. "A hatchling that cries in this way is not adjusting to the world. It is refusing to." "He is 4 days old," Caleb said. "Age is not an excuse," Kale said. The instincts are either there or they are not. Over the next 2 days, the Draconis staff tried everything they knew. They left Soren alone in the dark, which was traditional. A hatchling left alone learned quickly that the only comfort available was its own strength. Soren cried louder. They played recorded Draconis vocalization patterns, the deep resonant sounds that elders used to calm nest clutches. Soren ignored them entirely and kept crying. One of the younger Draconis officers, a male named Thax, tried making the sounds himself, live, standing close to the enclosure. Soren looked at him with polite golden eyes, sneezed, and went back to crying. Kale watched all of this and said nothing. But the silence had a shape to it. On the third night, Lena found Caleb sitting outside the medical bay with his hands on his knees and his eyes closed, listening to the sound through the door. "It is not getting better," she said, sitting down beside him. "No," he said. "Kale is going to push for the transfer again. If Soren keeps this up, Vreth might not be able to hold him off." Caleb opened his eyes and looked at the door. On the other side, faint but constant, the small crying sound continued. He thought about the night he had spent keeping the egg warm. He thought about the moment Soren had taken his first step across the blanket toward him. He thought about the way the hatchling had looked at him, not with fear, not with challenge, but with something that felt startlingly like trust. He stood up and opened the door. The medical bay was dim and quiet except for the sound. Soren was curled in the corner of his enclosure, wings folded, tail wrapped around himself, making that soft, continuous sound. He looked smaller in the low light. His scales caught a faint silver sheen from the lamp above him, and his golden eyes found Caleb immediately when he walked in. The crying did not stop. But Soren lifted his head. Caleb walked to the enclosure and knelt down in front of it. He sat there for a moment, just being present, not doing anything. Then, slowly, he reached in and gathered Soren up against his chest. Not roughly, not to restrain him, just the way you might hold something small and cold that needed warmth. He tucked one hand under Soren's body and pressed him gently against his sternum, and Soren stiffened for just a moment, wings half opening, body rigid with surprise. Then the steady beat of Caleb's heart went through the thin bones of Soren's chest. The crying stopped. It did not taper off or slow down, it just stopped, completely, like a switch had been turned. Soren went from trembling and tense to utterly still in the span of about 10 seconds. His wings folded back down. His tail curled loosely. His eyes closed. And within 2 minutes, with his small body pressed against the steady warmth of a human chest and the slow, regular rhythm of a human heartbeat moving through him, Soren fell asleep for the first time since he had been born. Caleb sat on the floor of the medical bay and did not move, because he did not want to wake him. Nobody had said anything yet. But when he looked up, he realized that the glass panel on the side of the medical bay was full of faces. Lena, 2 of the human researchers, 3 of the Draconis staff. Thax, pressed closest to the glass, with an expression that Caleb could not quite name. And behind all of them, standing very still in the doorway, Elder Kale, his old eyes moving between Caleb and the sleeping hatchling with an expression that was not disgust anymore. It was not approval either. It was something older and more complicated than either of those things. Caleb looked back down at Soren. The hatchling's breathing was deep and even, the slow breath of real sleep. Under his hands, Caleb could feel the warmth of those small silver scales, and the tiny regular vibration of a heartbeat that was no longer afraid. Outside the glass, nobody spoke. 3 weeks after Soren hatched, he learned to tilt his head. It was a small thing. Caleb had a habit, when he was reading or working on something that required focus, of tilting his head slightly to the left, as if the angle helped him think better. He had done it for so long that he did not notice it anymore. But Soren noticed. One evening Caleb was sitting at his desk with a datapad in his hand, frowning at a set of growth charts, and he heard a soft sound from the floor beside him. He looked down and found Soren sitting there with his head tilted at exactly the same angle, golden eyes fixed on the pad, looking for all the world like he was also trying to read it. Caleb stared at him for a moment. Soren stared back, tilted. "You are going to make everything very complicated," Caleb said. Soren made a small satisfied sound and put his head on Caleb's foot. The weeks had been good to the hatchling. He was still smaller than a typical Draconis juvenile of his age. The Draconis staff noted this often, not cruelly, Just with a matter-of-fact precision they applied to everything, but he was growing. Steadily. Every morning Lena took measurements, and every morning the numbers crept upward in ways that kept quietly defying the early projections. His scales had deepened from pale silver-gray to something closer to smoke and steel, with faint traces of blue at the edges that only showed up in certain light. His wings had filled out and strengthened. He walked with more confidence, ate well, and had developed a personality that the human crew found charming and the Draconis staff found confusing. The confusion came from how he behaved with people. A Draconis hatchling, by tradition and instinct, established hierarchy immediately. It pushed, tested, challenged, retreated, and pushed again until it understood the social structure around it. This was not aggression, it was just how a young dragon learned its place. Soren did not do this. Instead he approached every person with the same quiet, open curiosity. He nudged arms when he wanted attention. He brought things, small objects from around the station, a chewed pen cap, a twisted piece of wire, a smooth stone from outside, and deposited them at people's feet, which none of the humans recognized as significant, but all of the Draconis recognized immediately as a gesture that adult dragons only used with those they considered close. Soren was doing it with everyone. He did it with the cook who gave him scraps from the kitchen. He did it with the night shift engineer who let him sit on the console desk and watch the screens. He did it, to the shock of everyone present, with young Thax, the Draconis officer who had been watching Caleb and Soren from a distance for weeks. Thax had come into the common room one afternoon and found Soren there alone. He had stood very still, not sure what to do. Soren walked over to him, looked up at him with those enormous golden eyes, and placed a small flat stone next to his feet. Then he sat back and waited. Thax looked at the stone for a long time. Then, slowly, he sat down on the floor. Lena saw it through the doorway and went to find Caleb immediately. It was around this same time that Lena found the archive records. She had been researching Draconis hatchling development for her own paper, partly scientific interest, partly the quiet feeling that something important was being missed. She had worked through the modern records first, which were full of strength doctrine language and survival metrics and formal developmental milestones. Then she had gone backward, further into the historical archives that the Draconis Collective had shared with the station years ago as part of the original cooperation agreement, records that nobody had looked at carefully because they were old and written in an early form of Draconis notation that was slow to translate. What she found there changed things. Ancient Draconis nesting practices, from before the centuries of war that had reshaped their culture, described something very different from what was done now. Clutches had been communal. Multiple adults present at all times. Contact, physical, constant, between the adults and the hatchlings, not just feeding and protection but actual warmth, actual touch, the kind of sustained bodily presence that told a hatchling that it was not alone in the world. The records described a sound that young hatchlings made, a low, trembling sound, as a signal that they needed this contact. Not a sign of weakness. A signal. A communication. And the appropriate response, according to the oldest records, was simple. You answered it by being close. Somewhere in the long centuries of hardening, war, loss, the slow grinding away of everything soft, this had been forgotten. Or buried. The sound had been reinterpreted as weakness. The response had been replaced with isolation and discipline. And the knowledge that the sound meant something, that it was asking something that had a real answer, had simply stopped being passed down. Lena sat with this for a while before she brought it to anyone. She brought it to Vreth first. They sat in his office and she laid out the research carefully, the way she always did, not arguing, just presenting. Vreth listened without interrupting. He was very old, old enough that some of the ancient practices she was describing might not have been completely gone from his earliest memories. When she finished he was quiet for a long time. Kale will say the old ways were abandoned for good reason, he said at last. I know, Lena said. I'm not saying they weren't. I'm saying one thing got lost that maybe shouldn't have. Vreth looked out the window at the station yard. Outside, Soren was sitting in a patch of afternoon light with Caleb nearby, and Thax was there too, seated a little apart, watching with that careful expression that had become his usual one around them. The hatchling is well, Vreth said. It was not quite an endorsement. It was not quite an acknowledgement either. But he said it, and that was something. Meanwhile, Caleb had started keeping a notebook. Not a datapad, An actual paper notebook, the kind he had always preferred for things that felt important. Every evening he wrote down small observations about Soren. The things he responded to. The things he avoided. The sounds he made at different times and what they seemed to mean. The objects he brought to people and whether those people had responded in ways that seemed to satisfy him. It was not a scientific record exactly. It was more personal than that. But it was detailed, and after a while Lena asked to read it, and after she read it she was quiet for a day and then asked Caleb if she could use parts of it in a paper she was writing. "What kind of paper?" he asked. "The kind that might make some people uncomfortable," she said. "Write it," he said. The evenings settled into something that none of them had planned for, but all of them had come to rely on. Caleb would finish his work for the day and sit in the common room or at his desk, and Soren would find him and arrange himself nearby. Sometimes on the floor, sometimes pressed against Caleb's leg, sometimes, as he grew larger, draped across Caleb's lap in a way that was becoming increasingly impractical but that neither of them seemed willing to change. They had worked out a language of small gestures. Soren's tail flick meant he was content, his head press meant he wanted acknowledgement, his low hum was something Caleb could only describe as happiness. Caleb, for his part, had developed responses without thinking about them. A hand resting on Soren's side. A quiet word when the hatchling was unsettled. The steady presence that Soren's whole body seemed to orient toward the way a plant oriented toward light. One night Vreth passed the doorway of Caleb's quarters and stopped. Soren was asleep across Caleb's lap, taking up most of the space. Caleb was reading, his hand resting lightly on Soren's back, moving slightly every so often without Caleb seeming to notice he was doing it. The light was warm and low. The room was completely quiet except for Soren's slow breathing. Vreth stood there for a moment. Then he walked on. He did not mention it to anyone. But after that evening, he stopped attending Kale's strategy meetings about the hatchling's future placement. The ship appeared in orbit on a Thursday morning, and nobody at the station was surprised. They had known it was coming for almost 2 weeks. The news that a Draconis hatchling was being raised in daily contact with humans had moved through the collective faster than anyone had expected, and the reactions had split in exactly the way Vreth had predicted they would. Half the voices said it was an interesting development worth studying, and the other half said it was an embarrassment that needed to be corrected before it became a precedent. The second group, being louder and better organized, had won the argument about sending an inspector. High Speaker Doran arrived at the station in the early afternoon with a delegation of 4. He was tall even by Draconis standards, with dark bronze scales and the slow, deliberate movements of someone who had not been in a hurry for a very long time. He wore formal markings that Caleb had to look up to understand, and that Lena translated quietly as roughly equivalent to both judge and administrator. He was not there to be helpful. He was there to assess and decide. Caleb was not invited to the first meeting. He spent the time in the medical bay with Soren, which was where he always went when things at the station felt tense. Soren had grown considerably in the past weeks. He was heavier now, longer, more solid, his scales fully deepened into that dark smoke and steel color with the blue edges that showed in direct light. He still slept on or against Caleb whenever he had the option, which was becoming a physical challenge for both of them, and he still brought small objects to people he liked, and he still made the soft humming sound when he was content. He was not humming now. He had been restless all morning, pacing the length of the bay with his wings held slightly open, his tail moving in short, sharp sweeps that Caleb had learned to read as unease. Animals, all animals, Caleb thought, not just dragons, could feel tension in a room even when you did not tell them anything. Soren had felt something wrong the moment the delegation had walked through the station's front entrance, and nothing Caleb said had settled him. Caleb sat on the floor of the medical bay and waited. The meeting lasted 3 hours. When Lena came to find him, her face had the careful, controlled expression she wore when she was managing her own anger. "He wants the transfer done within 48 hours, she said. "He's calling Soren a ward of the collective and saying the current arrangement is damaging to proper development." He used the words unnatural conditions twice. "What did Vreth say?" Caleb asked. "Vreth said he would take it under advisement." She paused. Which, with Vreth, is about as close as he gets to saying no. Behind Caleb, Soren made a low sound. Not the crying sound, something different. Flatter. Less trembling and more wary, like a question with an edge to it. "Tell Doran I'd like to do a demonstration," Caleb said. Lena looked at him. What kind of demonstration? Let them try first, he said. Before any transfer happens. Let Doran's team spend 30 minutes with Soren using whatever methods they prefer. If Soren is calm and settled after 30 minutes, I won't say another word about it. Lena was quiet for a moment. And if he isn't? Caleb looked at Soren, who was looking back at him with those wide golden eyes, wings half raised, tail still moving in that short, unhappy sweep. Then we'll have shown them something, Caleb said. The demonstration was arranged for the following morning. Doran agreed to it with the particular confidence of someone who had no doubt about the outcome. The station's common room was set up as a neutral space, Soren was brought in, and Doran's delegation entered one at a time. Nina Carver, the station's young communications officer, stood by the observation window with a recording device, logging everything. She was 26 and had been at the station for 8 months, and she had spent most of that time being quiet and extremely good at her job. She had also, in the past weeks, become one of Soren's favorite people. He brought her stones more often than almost anyone else, which she had taken to collecting in a small dish on her desk. She did not say anything during the demonstration. She just watched and recorded. Doran's team tried for 40 minutes, not 30. They were patient and experienced, and they used every traditional method correctly. They used the low-resonant vocalization that was supposed to communicate safety to young hatchlings. They used a formal stillness stance that adult Draconis used to project calm authority. They offered food from their hands. They moved slowly and gave Soren every possible opening to settle. Soren did not settle. He retreated to the far corner of the room. His wings came up. His breathing went shallow and fast. And after about 20 minutes, he began to make the crying sound again, the soft, trembling, continuous sound that the station had not heard from him in weeks. It filled the room like something broken, and Caleb, watching from the hallway through the glass, felt it in his chest the way he always had. Doran stood in the center of the room with his arms at his sides, and his expression very controlled, and said nothing. One of his delegation stepped closer to Soren, using the calm authority stance again, and Soren pressed himself further into the corner and made a sound that was not crying anymore, but something lower and more frightened, and his claws left small marks in the floor. Nina looked at Caleb through the window. Caleb did not wait for anyone to give him permission. He opened the door and walked in. Soren crossed the room in 4 steps and pressed himself against Caleb's legs with enough force to stagger him slightly. Caleb put one hand on Soren's back and stood still. The crying stopped. Just like the first time, not gradually, not slowly, just stopped, as if the room itself exhaled. No one spoke. Doran looked at Soren, who was now pressing his head against Caleb's side with his wings folded and his tail looped loosely around Caleb's ankle. He looked at Caleb, who was standing with one hand on Soren's back, not triumphant, not performing anything, just present, the way he always was. Doran's expression moved through several things that were hard to name and landed on something that was neither approval nor retreat, just a careful and reluctant reckoning. The transfer, Doran said finally, will be postponed pending further observation. He turned and walked out. His delegation followed. Caleb crouched down and scratched Soren gently behind the ear ridge, the spot that always made Soren's eyes close halfway and his whole body go soft. Soren made a low warm sound and leaned into it. "It's all right," Caleb said quietly. "You did well." Nina lowered her recording device and looked through the window at the retreating delegation. Then she looked back at Caleb and Soren and wrote something small and private in the margin of her log that she never showed to anyone. Outside in the corridor, Thax had watched the whole thing from the far end, standing very still. When Doran's group passed him, he pressed himself against the wall to let them through. Then he looked back at the room where Caleb was still crouched with Soren, quiet and unhurried. Thax stood there for a long time before he walked away. 3 months after the egg cracked open on a blanket in the middle of the night, Soren was the size of a large dog and growing fast. The projections that the Draconis staff had made in those early uncertain weeks, the ones that had called him compromised, too small, too weak, unlikely to reach viable maturity, had been quietly set aside. Nobody threw them away. They were just no longer referenced in any official conversation, the way papers that have been proven wrong tend to migrate toward the back of the drawer. What the current data showed instead was this: Soren's bone density was at 94% of standard juvenile Draconis norms. His wingspan was slightly below average but within the acceptable range and gaining 2 centimeters every week. His scale thickness and hardness tested at normal levels. His reflexes were sharp. His problem-solving scores in the observation tasks the researchers ran were above average, not just for a Draconis juvenile, but for any of the species tracked at the station. He had, at some point in the past month, figured out how to open the latch on the medical bay door from the inside, which was not supposed to be possible, and had let himself out 3 times before Caleb installed a second latch higher up that required opposable thumbs. Soren had also started trying to use Caleb's hands to open things, standing on his back legs and wrapping both forepaws around Caleb's wrist and walking him toward the thing he wanted opened, which Lena had spent 15 minutes laughing about when she first saw it. "He is using you as a tool," she told Caleb. "I know," Caleb said, opening the cabinet. Lena's research paper had been submitted to the Joint Academic Board 3 weeks after Doran's visit. It was titled, in the dry and careful language of academic writing, something about ancestral bonding practices in early Draconis development and their relationship to juvenile behavioral outcomes. The title was quiet. The contents were not. She had laid out the historical record methodically, connected it to Soren's case without overstating the causality, and ended with a section of recommendations that was phrased politely but said clearly, the way hatchlings were being raised was not the only way, it was not the oldest way, and the evidence suggested it was not the best way. The paper moved through the academic community of both species like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples were wide and slow and nobody was shouting. It was not that kind of argument, but the circles kept spreading. 3 Draconis scholars had requested copies within the first week. A human developmental biologist from the outer stations had sent Lena a message that was 12 paragraphs long and ended with the words, "Thank you for writing this." A Draconis institution on the second continent of Vaelther had requested a formal consultation. Kale had not responded. But Kale had also not filed the formal removal petition he had been preparing before Doran's visit, and after the demonstration in the common room, his name had stopped appearing on the correspondence about Soren's future. In the 4th month, the Draconis Collective held a formal assembly session on interspecies development research. High Speaker Doran, standing in front of a room full of elders and delegates that was being broadcast to 12 research stations across the planet, proposed a joint research program. He did not call it what it was. He framed it in the careful language of scientific advancement and mutual benefit and the ongoing cooperation between species that the collective valued. He did not mention Soren by name. He did not mention Caleb at all. He did not say that anything the collective had been doing for the past several centuries was wrong, or that a small cracked egg that nobody expected to survive had cracked open something else as well. He did not need to say those things. The people in the room who needed to understand them already did. At the station, life had settled into a rhythm that felt, for the first time, like something that would last. Thax had become a regular presence in the evenings. He had started sitting with Soren in the afternoons, not doing much, just being there, the way he had seen Caleb be there, and Soren had responded by treating him with the same open warmth he gave everyone he trusted. Thax had started writing his own notes in a small journal, observations and questions, and he had started showing them to Caleb at the end of the week. He did not ask Caleb to explain everything. He mostly just read his own notes out loud and let the silence after them do the work. One evening he asked Caleb directly, "How did you know what to do with Soren? That first night you held him?" Caleb thought about it for a moment. "I did not know," he said. "I just did not want him to be alone." Thax was quiet for a while. Then, "That is a very simple answer." "Yes," Caleb said. Vreth came to find Caleb on a quiet morning near the end of the 4th month. He walked into the lab, stood in the doorway for a moment, and looked at Soren, who was sprawled across most of the floor between the 2 central tables, asleep, taking up considerably more space than he used to. He looked at Caleb, who was at his desk writing in his paper notebook, his hand moving slow and steady. "He lives," Vreth said. 2 words. Flat and plain, no decoration. But Vreth said them with something underneath them, something that had weight, and Caleb looked up and met his eyes and nodded once. That was the whole conversation. Vreth left. Caleb went back to his notes. 3 different posting offers arrived for Caleb in the 5th month. One was from a major research institution in the Northern Territory with a salary that made Lena's eyes go wide when she saw the number. One was from the Joint Interspecies Council, offering him a formal advisory role that would have put his name on every significant paper in his field for the next decade. One was from an outer station doing work he genuinely found interesting, with a team he had always respected. He turned them all down. Politely. Without much explanation. Lena did not push him on it. She knew the answer already. It was sleeping on the floor of the lab, currently occupying enough space that 3 people had to walk around him to get to the equipment cabinets. On the last night of the 4th month, Thax stayed later than usual. He stood at the end of the corridor outside Caleb's quarters, looking through the open door at the end of the hall where the light was still on. Caleb was at his desk. Soren was no longer small enough to sleep on Caleb's lap. Those days were finished, practically speaking, but he had found a solution that seemed to satisfy him. He had arranged himself around the base of the chair entirely, his body curved around the legs of it, his head resting on Caleb's foot, his tail curled up along the wall. He was deeply asleep. Caleb was doing his reports. His hand moved occasionally to rest on Soren's side without him looking down, the way you reach for something.